We're joined on the line by Dr. David Hughes. David, are you there?
I am there, Tony.
Oh, hi, David. Nice to hear your voice again. We spoke to you, just to refresh listeners' memory, I think it was last autumn, about a report that you did on the unexplained evidence of unexplained materials, both in the COVID jabs themselves. This is the Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca jabs, and also in people's bodies and bloodstreams after they've been jabbed. So before we talk about this paper we're going to do today, can you just give us a brief summary of that? So hopefully just to refresh people's memory who may have heard you last time.
Right, yes. Well, this was a paper that I published in September, and it summarised the findings of 26 research teams around the world that had actually conducted microscopic and spectroscopic analysis of the contents of the vials and also of the blood of vaccinated patients. And to cut a long story short, the results were quite horrifying. There were all kinds of artefacts in there that clearly shouldn't have been there, many of which look man-made, and there's speculation that some of this could in fact be covert technology.
Yeah, so the paper is called Evidence of a Global Crime Against Humanity. But anyway, we're looking today at a previous paper of yours, which you did mention, I think, at the time. But it's taken me a little while to get round to asking you about it. The paper is called Wall Street, the Nazis, and the Crimes of the Deep State. And I wonder if you could just start by telling us a bit about why this is relevant today, you know, similarities between then and now.
Because it seems to me that there is a global attempt underway to collapse liberal democracy and replace it with a novel form of totalitarianism, which goes by the name of technocracy. Now, just as the final solution back in the days of Nazi Germany didn't happen overnight and took many years of laying the groundwork through legal, cultural and other means, it seems to me as though we are at the thin edge of the wedge here. And what I wanted to do with this paper was to draw people's attention to some of the similarities between now and then, but also to use a class analysis to explain some of those similarities.
Okay, can you run us through some of them? Because, I mean, for many, I'm a little bit suspicious about what's going on, particularly with the rise of the technocracy now. And I wonder whether, it's coming at a time where many people who can remember the Second World War, can remember the times of strife and the totalitarianism of the Hitler regime, etc., have now just passed away. And so there isn't that community memory left of it, David.
That's a very important observation. And again, just to preface this, I'm not saying that we are already in a state of full-blown totalitarianism, but I am trying to say that the warning signs are now here. So you asked about some of the parallels. Well, for example, the kind of mass psychosis that we've seen over the last few years, that the willingness of people to surrender their liberties, a kind of descent into madness almost on a mass scale. All of this was seen in Nazi Germany. The use of military-grade propaganda against the population, the use of the big lie, the idea of collectivism.
Okay, I think we all know about the big lies from back then, but what about the big lie now?
Oh, well, the biggest one is the pandemic. And if you look at the, particularly Dennis Rancourt's paper co-authored with two colleagues from 2021, where he analyses all-cause mortality data in the United States, which is some of the most reliable data out there, he demonstrates very convincingly, in my opinion, that the pattern of deaths in the United States was not consistent with a viral pandemic. There was what he called jurisdictional heterogeneity. In other words, very high spikes in death in places like New York. Meanwhile, most of the country, nothing out of the ordinary. And we've seen this in other countries as well. So once you proceed from that hard data to the idea that actually there is no evidence of a viral pandemic behaving in the kinds of ways that you would expect epidemiologically, then the whole thing begins to unravel. And of course, that opens the door then to looking at the PCR tests, the masks, and all of the other lies that were told in the name of
well, sorry.
the science.
I mean, I did interrupt you, asking you to talk a bit more about the big lie. But what about other parallels?
Okay, so collectivism, this idea of protecting others. We have to do things for the common good. It's worth remembering that just after the Reichstag fire, the decree for the protection of people and state was passed, more commonly known as the Reichstag's decree. But nevertheless, that same idea is there. Demonisation of outgroups, spreaders of disease. Of course, the Jews back then, and we had the pandemic of the unvaccinated, but it's a similar kind of logic.
I mean, so did they actually say in Nazi Germany that Jews spread diseases?
Yeah, they likened them to vermin. And of course, that provides one of the pretexts for their extermination.
Good God, okay.
Kevin Corbett referred back in the spring of 2020, he used the phrase the Nazification of the NHS, and he was pilloried at the time for that. But what he was talking about was the fact that health services have now been placed under a kind of command and control regime and subordinated to this new biosecurity paradigm. And I think in many ways that has been borne out, particularly with the administration of the injections. Speaking of which, approximately 5.5 billion people supposedly have now had one of these things, at least one of these things. This is a mass medical experiment carried out on humanity. Of course, no long-term safety data, inadequate trials and all the rest of it. Well, I mean, I think that's consistent with eugenics and experimentation on the human race, as were the lockdowns, the masks and the social distancing, all forms of mass experimentation. We're dealing also with issues of state-sponsored euthanasia. We saw that in this country, for example, with the Midazolam scandal, but also the MAID euthanasia program in Canada. Again, it's kind of thin edge of the wedge, but it's very disturbing when these kind of things appear. We've seen censorship. We've seen silencing of dissent, which one critic writing in the BMJ back in 2021 said belong firmly in the realms, quote, of a totalitarian Nazi dystopia. We've seen the undermining of parliamentary democracy and the rule of law, with some very draconian provisions, not only in the Coronavirus Act, but some of the other acts and bills that have been working their way through Parliament, like the Police Crime and Sentencing Bill, the Online Safety Bill, the Covert Human Intelligence Act. I mean, these are all pernicious, really, in terms of democracy. There's the kind of the fascist fusion of the state and big business, which we're seeing in all kinds of ways. This emergency alert that's coming up on Sunday sees all of the phone companies working with the government in that regard, and that's just one example. And there's also the pushing of eco-politics and the green agenda. And again, much of that goes back to Nazi Germany. So actually, there are parallels all over the place for those who choose to look. Well,
okay. Great long list there. But what about the Nazi Greens? I've not heard about that before.
Oh, the eco-politics, the kind of the blood and soil mentality, the romanticisation of the forest. In other words, in Nazi Germany, environmental discourse bled into politics and vice versa. So again, I'm not saying that what we've got here is exactly the same, but it's certainly worth taking note of the fact that the rise of green discourse and the so-called climate emergency and so on just so happens to be going hand in hand with all of these other manoeuvres, which I think are pushing in the direction of totalitarianism.
Do you want to explain why you think this is happening now, the resurgence of these Nazi themes and influences?
Yeah, so, I mean, I think much of this has to do with the year 2019. And a couple of things happened in that year. First of all, there were all kinds of indicators of financial crisis. And perhaps the best one to look at is the meeting at Jackson Hole, Wyoming, of all of the leading international finance people. And that's when the going direct plan was formulated by BlackRock. And in many ways, that's the kind of the financial aspect of what we're seeing now and in the last couple of years, and pushing towards central bank digital currencies and so on. But the key point is it has to do with a moment of financial crisis in which they basically realised that the old system, the old monetary order, as we've known it, at least since 1973 with the petrodollar, or you could perhaps go back further to 1945 and kind of US hegemony at the centre of the system. For all intents and purposes, that paradigm is no longer fit, and we need something else. And on the other side of the ledger, in 2019, mass disenchantment with the system after more than 10 years of austerity following the 2008 financial crisis, manifested itself in protests in 35 countries around the world. And we're talking mass protests here. So that's about 1 in 5 countries. So clearly huge levels of social discontent with a system which is on its last legs. And as Giorgio Agamben, the Italian philosopher, said, the paradigm of rule, the existing paradigm of rule, as had been around for a very long time, was clearly deemed to be no longer fit for purpose. And that was the moment at which they threw what Kees van der Pijl calls the COVID emergency brake. And so all of what we've seen has been a kind of huge psychological operation to try and intimidate, victimize, bully, coerce, demoralize the public into accepting these very, very draconian agendas which are now in play.
Well, I must put in a plug for Kees, for someone who I remember writing about the Bilderbergers back in the 1990s when no academics, pretty much, apart from Mike Peters up at Leeds Metropolitan University, was doing so. His book, which is out recently, is called States of Emergency, and it says pretty much exactly that, David, that the elites of the world realise that as they destroy democracy, they start to take control from the top down, that people at the bottom will start to rise up and that they need to control that too.
That's absolutely what it's about. So, I mean, it's fundamentally a global class war, and a minority, a small minority of humanity, who are nevertheless fabulously wealthy and own the means of production, I think that they are literally going to war now against the rest of humanity in order to achieve their aim, which is the transition to global technocracy. And we should be under no illusions that global technocracy is a form of biodigital enslavement.
So how do the other big superpowers like China and Russia fit into this, or don't they? Well,
of course they do. China is what Ian Davis refers to as the world's first technate. So Rockefeller investment into China has been going on for many decades. And, of course, where was the social credit system, for example, first pioneered successfully? In China. So we're seeing many of it's almost like a kind of a petri dish, a test ground. And now that it's been rolled out in China and it's been proven to be feasible, it would appear that model is now intended for the West and eventually everywhere else.
And what about Russia and Ukraine?
That's a slightly separate issue. I mean, we're dealing with geopolitics rather than the previous things I've been talking about. But I mean, that's an interesting one because that's taking up a lot of attention. It's generating a lot of fear, of course. It's being used as the pretext for energy shortages, fuel price hikes, and all the rest of it. But I mean, as John Mearsheimer predicted back in 2015, the kind of relentless NATO-EU expansion ever since the end of the Cold War, coupled with the events of 2014, would inevitably lead to conflict with Ukraine, and indeed that's what we've seen.
Yeah. Well, anyway, your paper starts with this idea of Wall Street and the Nazis, Wall Street and the rise of Hitler.
Yeah, I mean, I draw a lot in the early stages on the work of Anthony C. Sutton from the 1970s. And this is work which has been ignored, really, for far too long. But through careful archival research, he demonstrates quite a lot of fairly astounding things in terms of Wall Street financing, both of the Soviet Union, but also of Nazi Germany. And he makes a fairly convincing case, in my opinion, that it would not have been possible for Germany to get back on its feet, to produce the kind of war machine that it did, let alone go to war, were it not for the backing of some very wealthy bankers and industrialists from the United States.
Well, it's not just the US, is it? I mean, we know that Montague Norman, who was the boss of the Bank of England, and as well as our own king, Edward VIII, were very pro-Nazi. In fact, the Bank of England were very helpful to the Nazis building up their arms.
Yes, and again, we're dealing here with issues of class. And if you put yourself for a moment in the position of the ruling class, then clearly totalitarianism is a very attractive proposition because you establish total or near total control over society. It's a very effective means of crushing working class opposition. And of course, taking out the brown shirts, the working class wing, was one of the first things that Hitler did through the SS when he came to power. So it makes perfect sense that at moments such as this, when there's great instability in the system, when there's a real risk of protest becoming mass resistance and possibly spilling over into revolution, that actually the powers that be would want to manufacture this new form of totalitarianism, technocracy, in order to keep the population in check.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should also add to that, with Anthony Sutton's work, the idea of the City of London and the British royal family in the rise of Hitler. But anyway, look, we had on this programme, must be probably 10 years ago now, and I brought him in the car down from, bless him, from Marlborough, a chap called Harry Beckhoff, who worked for MI6 during the war. And after the war, he was asked to do denazification. He was actually very friendly with Winston Churchill, and this whole idea was that MI6 were going through Germany after the war, making sure that anyone that was a senior Nazi wasn't in any kind of powerful position. He went to Cologne University, and he discovered that one of the heads of politics there was actually an absolutely fanatical, die-hard Nazi, and so he sent information back to the occupying forces saying, well, this guy needs to be removed from his position because he's a Nazi. We don't really want these people running the country after we leave. And actually there was questions asked about it in the House of Commons, saying, oh, this man, Harry Beckhoff, is trying to get rid of this very decent, lovely chap. And in fact, eventually he was removed. But it shows the power the Nazis had to stop denazification, when it was one of their friends that wanted to stay in power after the war. And of course, we know also that there were quite a lot of Nazis, particularly Wehrmacht, people who were, working for NATO after the war. But anyway, it didn't really quite manage. I'm also thinking, David, of a chap I had a chat with when I was over in Holland doing one of my talks, which was called The Traitors of Arnhem, really about my book, but actually over in Holland, waiting for the ferry to come back to the UK in The Hague, just chatting to one of the locals, and he was saying, well, the trouble was, he was an old chap, he was saying, well, the trouble was after the war, that my uncle and my parents told me that some of the people who were the collaborators with the Nazis were just straight away in Holland in charge after World War II, and they were running Holland after the end of the war. So they were wondering, well, what on earth is going on here? But anyway, it wasn't a massive success, denazification, was it, after World War II?
Certainly not. And I have a section about this in the article that we're discussing today called The Failures of Denazification. And it was US officials predominantly that were responsible for this so-called effort at denazifying. They were principally controlled by Wall Street interests, and what we find is that many of these senior Nazis and their industrialist backers evaded justice. So big names like Alfred Krupp and Friedrich Flick, they were back in their old positions as early as the 1950s. No Americans were tried in this, despite the role of Wall Street and Henry Ford and others in facilitating the rise of Hitler. The Bank of International Settlements is also quite interesting in this regard. It managed Nazi gold, and it had several Nazis on its board of directors, some of whom were involved in processing dental gold looted from the mouths of concentration camp victims. And there was a call back in 1944 with the Bretton Woods Conference that the Bank of International Settlements actually be liquidated. And as we know, that never happened. So despite its complicity with the crimes of the Third Reich, the Bank of International Settlements was able to carry on. And there were some very powerful individuals who assumed some very influential roles. So Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, for example, co-founded the Bilderberg Group. You have Walter Hallstein, first president of the EEC. Adolf Heusinger became the chairman of the NATO Military Commission. Kurt Kiesinger became West German Chancellor. Kurt Waldheim became president of Austria. I mean, all of these men were former Nazis, but nevertheless, after the war, when we start to deal with issues of global governance, denazification simply wasn't a concern.
Martin Summers, maybe we can bring you in here, because there was most definitely a flavour, wasn't there, after World War II? Even Winston Churchill famously said, Operation Unthinkable, I think it was called, that wouldn't it be wonderful, because we dislike the Soviet Union so much, maybe we could use one of these wonderful nuclear weapons and bomb Moscow with it.
Well, that is overwhelmingly the case. I mean, we know that happened, because we've got the evidence from Freedom of Information requests subsequently. Well, I mean, the Third World War began the day the Second World War ended, didn't it?
Actually, Vincenzo Vinciguerra says that in the Gladio film by Alan Frankovich. He says 1945, World War II ended and World War III began. Well, what about this Bank of International Settlements? This is a sort of central banker's central bank, and it's quite important. If the Bretton Woods Conference said, well, this bank should be shut down because they're so powerful that they allowed Hitler to come, to fund his build-up of arms, and there was nothing we could do about it. They're still very much in existence today, aren't they?
They are, and as was been said, there was talk about abolishing the Bank of International Settlements. There was talk of creating an international currency called Bancor, which wouldn't be controlled by an individual government. These were the ideas of John Maynard Keynes.
Well, surely the IMF is the IMF controlled by the United States or not?
The IMF is ultimately controlled by the United States. They have a controlling stake in it, which is exactly why the Chinese are trying to set up an alternative economic system with the Russians, because they want to break away from it all.
So, David, what do you make of the? I mean, this central bank survived, and as I understand it, what they call the Tower of Basel. I think there is a book called The Tower of Basel about the BIS in Switzerland, in Basel. That they actually have their own jurisdiction there. They have their own police force. So even if someone is in there accused of fraud or even murder, then they have their own police force to investigate it. The Swiss police aren't even allowed in.
It says a lot, doesn't it, about where the power really lies. And of course, in a sense, it's a kind of a way of coordinating central banks internationally. But you have this international finance capital class, beginning with the kind of the big investment banks, who of course are then tremendously influential over the federal banks, and then that's all in turn coordinated at a higher level by the Bank of International Settlements. I mean, really, this is where the root of so many of the problems in the world lies, in my opinion.
Yes, so there apparently quite a lot of Nazis were headhunted after the war, and you talk about something called the Unit 731, which I hadn't heard of.
Oh, well, Unit 731, that was Japan, and it was a really vicious part of the Japanese Imperial Army. So this was performing lethal human experiments during the war. In fact, earlier than that, we're talking kind of vivisection, injecting victims with venereal diseases disguised as vaccinations, using live human targets to test grenades, flamethrowers, etc. I mean, really, really nasty stuff. Anyhow, after the war, some of these war criminals were granted secret immunity by the United States in exchange for their, in inverted commas, expertise. And this wasn't revealed until 1981. It wasn't formally conceded by the US government until 1999. And the relevant documentation didn't come out until 2017. So when you know all of that, then you need to reappraise the history that we know of in terms of US biowarfare research, and indeed some of the biowarfare that the US deployed against North Korea, and it makes for rather an ugly picture, I'm afraid.
Okay, you also have one of your chapters entitled Wall Street, Kennan and the Birth of the US National Security State. Well, we all know what the US National Security State is, I hope we do, but which is the deep state, effectively. And what about this? What is Kennan?
Right, so this is referring to George Kennan, who was one of the major power brokers at the time. Now, one of the points that I make in this particular section is that the national security state, set up through the National Security Act of July 1947, gave birth to the whole kind of national security infrastructure that we know today, including the CIA. and that essentially this was the product of Wall Street men. William H. Jackson, Frank Wisner, Ferdinand Eberstadt, James Forrestal, William Donovan. It's very, very interesting. I mean, we're really dealing with nothing but Wall Street bankers and lawyers here. Now, Kennan was invited at the behest of James Forrestal, who was a former Dillon Read and Company investment banker, to produce not only his famous long telegram of 1946, but also the famous piece that appeared in Foreign Affairs in 1947 called The Sources of Soviet Conduct. And Kennan was appointed as the inaugural director of policy planning in the US. So this is the State Department's internal think tank, if you like. So he was an extremely influential figure. Now, he tends to be remembered in kind of cliched terms as, such as the kind of the godfather of containment and this kind of thing. But what I point out in my article is that actually this is a man who had profoundly fascist sympathies. So if you go back to 1938, Kennan was proposing an authoritarian form of government in the United States. He wanted to see suffrage withdrawn from what he called bewildered and ignorant women, immigrants, and African Americans. He was an admirer of the fascist regime in Austria. After the war, he was the architect of the reverse course in Japan, which reinstated pre-war political class A war criminals. He didn't want to know about Nazi war crimes when dealing with Germany. He thought that it would be better, in his words, to, quote, hold the present ruling class of Germany strictly to its task and teach it the lessons we wish to learn. Meanwhile, in Latin America, he was advocating, quote, harsh measures of repression, which, of course, we all know where that went in Latin America eventually with Operation Condor and so on. So the point I'm making here is that even in these early Cold War years, you had key men at the heart of this put in place by Wall Street, essentially, who had profoundly fascist sympathies.
What is the dual state?
So the dual state was a term that was used by Hans Morgenthau initially in 1955. And he drew a distinction between what he called the regular state hierarchy, which is the kind of the visible state that we all see and are familiar with, but also a security hierarchy as well. And the security hierarchy kind of operates in the background. So the regular hierarchy, it's visible, it obeys the rule of law and so on. But the security hierarchy in the background monitors and controls that regular hierarchy and is capable of exercising veto power over it, often in terms of emergency measures taken in the name of security. So Ola Tunander wrote some really interesting stuff about this, and you can link it, of course, also to ideas previously about the invisible government. But when we get into the kind of age of security in the early 1950s or even late 1940s, we are talking NATO, of course. And what Tunander argues is that with an organisation like NATO, even though you seem to have lots of separate countries, each with their own kind of security organisations, in actual fact, the whole thing is what he calls a kind of a US superstate. And actually the US, perhaps you might want to say Anglo-American intelligence, kind of has this kind of oversight of the whole thing and is capable of stepping in and exercising veto power at any moment. And that ultimately was what led into, for instance, the Gladio stay-behind armies, which were run by NATO. And you mentioned Vincenzo Vinciguerra, and of course all of that stuff really came to the fore in the 1970s. So, in other words, a lot of this has only come to light in relatively recent years. But when you take it back, you can find that there are these kind of hidden power structures and arrangements in place right from the very beginning of the post-World War II or early Cold War period. And actually much of what we've seen over the last few decades are these power structures becoming ever more visible to the point where with COVID, for those who are willing to look and investigate, they're really quite obvious.
You do get the idea that there's a sort of Jimmy Savile mentality amongst some of these people, that they think, well, so long as I can get away with it until I die, then it's all right, and they obviously don't seem to have any interest whatsoever in leaving a decent legacy to their names.
Absolutely, and it goes back to the criminal dimension of a lot of this, in fact, and if you look at Whitney Webb's recent work in relation to Epstein. But that's just one part of the picture. She actually traces it all the way back to the kind of era that I'm talking about, and the influence of the mafia and so on. And she reaches the conclusion that today, ultimately, it's the criminals who are in charge, and I find it hard to disagree. No,
me too. Now, this is something, the deep state we associate with the United States, but it's not just, is it? It's now spread, certainly mostly across the West, certainly with connections into China too, obviously, maybe at a different level than over here. But how is it the mechanism by which it's become something transnational now? Well, about, the ending of exchange controls here by Margaret Thatcher at the beginning of the 1980s. Was just commenting the other week that this was the first thing she did, in order to make sure that money can flow all over the world, and, that foreign companies can buy up your infrastructure if they wish, once it's been privatised. But it is something that is now transnational, isn't it, the deep state? Yeah, and I have to wonder if it hasn't been that way really since 1947 or not long afterwards. We're dealing here primarily with intelligence agencies, although of course, in partnership with banks and major corporations and so on. But if you think about the Five Eyes system, this goes back to 1946. We still use the term Five Eyes as though there's only 5 members of it. But what you actually find is that already, as early as 1948, Canada was invited to join, Norway in 1952, Denmark in 1954, West Germany, Australia, New Zealand came in 1955. So, in other words, these intelligence operations and organisations were already becoming transnational from a very early point. And the Gladio operation, that was centred on Italy, but there were similar operations all over Europe, and this was coordinated by NATO in an obviously transnational manner. So the kind of false flag terrorist attacks that it carried out, we're talking Italy, Spain, Germany, France, Turkey, Greece, all over the place. These events went off, particularly after 1968, were then blamed on communist organisations. And it was a means, essentially, of crippling the West. And it's very interesting. If I could just read a quote by Vinci Guerra, seeing as you mentioned him. In 1984, he testified in court. He said this, quote, "You had to attack civilians, the people, women, children, innocent people, unknown people, far removed from any political game. The reason was quite simple. They were supposed to force these people, the Italian public, to turn to the state to ask for greater security. That was precisely the role of the right in Italy. It placed itself at the service of the state, which created a strategy aptly called the strategy of tension, insofar as they had to get ordinary people to accept that at any moment over a period of 30 years, from 1960 to the mid-1980s, a state of emergency could be declared. So people would willingly trade part of their freedom for the security of being able to walk the streets or go on trains or enter a bank. This is the political logic behind all the bombings. They remain unpunished because the state cannot condemn itself." Now, I find this a remarkable quote because, in a sense, that describes really rather accurately the logic of the war on terror after 9/11. And so you can see how these operations were kind of almost tried and tested back in the 70s and 80s, and then rolled out on a global scale in the 21st century. Well, I hope you'll have your phone. You'll be on Sunday at 3 p.m. You'll be poised by your phone, ready to obey whatever command comes down there. David. Well, I'm afraid I'm not dumb enough to have a smartphone. I've got my old Nokia, and I don't think it will affect me. Well, and even so, like I was saying earlier, we do have a link up on our show page, or we'll have tonight anyway, to how to switch these things off before it happens. But anyway, of course, the fact of the matter is this: as you connect up to the internet, it connects up to you, and as you have your phone on a network, the network is listening to you and can listen to you whenever it wishes. I was, just as an anecdote, around a friend's place a few months ago, and she picked up her phone and said, "Well, what's this?" And everything we've been discussing over the previous couple of minutes was typed out on her phone. It had been just writing it on her phone. So that's the way things work, folks. Anyway, what about the Cold War popping up again?
Well, I mean, in light of all of this emergent knowledge now about the deep state, one of the things I argue in the article is that we really need to reappraise the history of the Cold War and some of the main narratives that are told. So if you go back to Kennan's long telegram, or The Sources of Soviet Conduct, his 1947 article, you get this image of the Soviet Union as this kind of implacable foe, this existential threat. And it comes through, again, in NSC 68, 1950 security document, primarily authored by Paul Nitzer, who, again, was a former vice president of Dillon Read & Co. And the idea is always that the Soviet Union possesses this kind of overwhelming, civilization-ending threat. Well, we now know that was radically overblown. And that whole discourse essentially provided a pretext for US imperialism. And so you can go back and actually look at US-Russian relations even before World War II and find that they're remarkably cozy in certain ways. I mean, one interesting anecdote that Sutton has is that there's a single address, 120 Broadway in New York, which housed not only the first Bolshevik ambassador to the US, but also the Bankers Club, directors of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the American International Corporation. They were literally sharing the same address. That the Harriman family had long-standing close ties with the Kremlin, and even towards the end of World War II and after World War II, contrary to this narrative of total enmity between the US and the Soviet Union, what you find is, for example, Churchill's percentage note at the Fourth Moscow Conference in 1944, which essentially Stalin kind of agreed on straight away. And the idea was that he wouldn't interfere with the post-war restabilization of capitalism in Western Europe in exchange for being able to keep control over Eastern Europe. So there was already that kind of understanding. And then after World War II, the Soviet Union was actually heavily reliant on US financial support and actually expected to receive that support as a moral right because of what it did to defeat the Nazis. So I won't go into it all here. But, listeners can read it for themselves in the article, but I kind of trace this history right through the Cold War era and show that there are actually some fundamental areas of collaboration between the US and the USSR. One of the key ones, of course, is suppressing class conflict. So it's very telling that when there were major working class uprisings in East Germany in 1953 and Hungary in 1956, this would have been an ideal opportunity for the West to put real pressure on the Soviet Union. And it didn't. And in actual fact, from that moment on, Radio Free Europe and the Voice of America never again called on Eastern Europeans to revolt. So you can see that the two sides were fundamentally in cahoots when it came to suppressing the international working class. Now, obviously, they had their differences as well. Obviously, geopolitical tensions are real. But what I'm arguing is that at an even more fundamental level, the level of class, there's a basic collaboration and cooperation there.
Yeah, I think in a way you're right about some of the things that are going on behind this geopolitics in the past. We're now only just now realising some of these things that happened. I can remember interviewing John Loftus a couple of years ago. I think it was called The Secret War on the Jews, is the title of his book. But he made it clear that when the State of Israel was being created back in the 1940s, that Nelson Rockefeller, who was delivering the South American and other votes at the United Nations for the Israelis, said to their Prime Minister to be Ben Gurion, you can have vengeance against the Nazis or a state, but not both, because quite a lot of the powerful financial interests in South America were Nazi interests. And so, if you promise that there's not going to be any vengeance against the Nazis, then you can have their votes, and you'll get their votes, and they did.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have a comment on that, but just to note that the Rockefeller influence, as always, is there.
Yeah, certainly is. Okay, so intelligence crimes, because a lot of this, what you're talking about, is relating to the intelligence services, they like to call themselves, but in a way, maybe they're intelligence criminals.
Yes, indeed. Intelligence crime is a concept that I've taken from Willem de Lint in his recent book. And we're dealing here with crimes that, well, they take place in different ways and on varying scales, but some of them take place on a scale which almost defies comprehension. Killing so many people, or staging acts of such spectacular terrorism. But at the same time, somehow they kind of remain invisible because of propaganda. They remain unpunished because the perpetrators stand above the law. And in particular, they remain underanalyzed by academics, which is my major concern here. So the section I have on intelligence crime traces the influence of the CIA in particular through the history of post-1945 US foreign policy right the way through to the present day. And unfortunately, it makes for a very long and grim list of coups, covert operations, reverse waves of democratization in Latin America, biowarfare techniques during the Korean War, the 1965 coup in Indonesia, where somewhere between 1 and 2 million people lost their lives, Operation Phoenix in Vietnam, again, mass murder of innocent civilians. On and on and on it goes. I mean, I talk about Rwanda and Turkey and Iraq in the 1990s. It's extremely grim. And again, I think people need to be aware of just how much evil, how much really serious mass atrocity has taken place at the hands of this deep state, because that's what we're faced with now. That's what we're dealing with. And one of the points I make is that a lot of this was directed against foreign populations in the 20th century. After 9/11, the focus started to turn more on domestic populations, not necessarily in terms of the mass atrocity yet, but in terms of putting together the architecture for oppression and moving societies ever more in an authoritarian direction, ever further away from liberal democracy. And when you can understand that historical arc, and then you look at the mass atrocities that have taken place during the COVID era, again, it signals a clear and present danger to me that we are now, again, looking potentially here at the thin edge of a move to totalitarianism on a worldwide scale.
Well, let's hope not. But what do you put that down to? I mean, this is a big question you're asking here. Why is it that the mass media fails to address some of the biggest crimes, as you called crimes against humanity, going on in the world today? And not just that, our education system and academia doesn't want to know. Yeah,
again, I mean, well, this has been going on for over a century, really. And again, you can trace it back to the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.
But what's going on in the mindset of the individual, lecturers, teachers, journalists who should be tackling this, editors? What I suppose I'm trying to get at here, do you think it's a structural thing that they just cannot do it, or is it that they're turning their heads away from this?
I think there will be some who are turning their heads away, but I think many genuinely don't understand what is happening, or wouldn't believe it if you told it to them and provided the evidence. It's the whole cognitive dissonance thing. I think in our previous conversation I highlighted the role of funding in academia, and a lot of good research gets done that's funded. But of course, what it does mean is that because the funders are very rich, powerful organisations, they have no interest in funding anything which will fundamentally challenge the status quo. And so that kind of work doesn't get done, because in order to become an academic, you have to win funding. In order to get promotion, you have to win funding. The whole system has become tied to money. And in that very kind of neoliberal corporate capitalist setup, it's obvious why you're not going to get any really, really critical analysis of the system itself. And I guess the same is going to be true in journalism. I'm minded of Noam Chomsky's interview with Andrew Marr decades ago, when Andrew Marr says to Chomsky, look, are you telling me that I can't, think for myself? I'm very kind of obstreperous, I won't be told what to do, ask the questions I want. And Chomsky smiles back wryly and says, well, I'm sure you do, and I'm sure you believe every word that you're saying. But the point is, if you did think anything different, you wouldn't be sitting in that chair. So the system selects the very kind of people who, by their very nature, for whatever reason, are happy to go along with it. So it does lead us, it's a very difficult area. It's what Gramsci referred to as hegemony, a kind of form of cultural control through the media, through education, through religious establishments as well. Whereby these go ahead.
Sorry, Martin Summers, this is a frog boiling moment, isn't it, really? I mean, slowly but surely, in education and academia particularly, the various avenues of research have become slowly but surely privately funded. I mean, we had on here a discussion, Is Science Dead?, with doctors Chris Exley and Chris Busby. Chris Exley lost his job at Keele University because he was looking into the negative effects potentially of aluminium in vaccines, and then he was told, no, you're not allowed to actually be part of this university anymore, and we're not going to allow you to even do private fundraising to do research at this university. So, Martin, what is going on here? Slowly but surely we've seen a complete shifting of academia, and actually with the BBC, I suppose, to a lesser extent, from the government funding over to private funding for all of this.
Well, there's been a privatisation process, for sure. But I think, as we've heard, this has been going on for a long time. It's coming to a head. We certainly are in an inflection point with all of this. But it's been going on for a long time. And it amazes me why people, the world has always been like this. It's never been better than this, and it's now worse than it has been.
Wasn't it better after the Second World War?
Well, after the Second World War, there was a brief moment in the West where, because of the existence of an alternative system in Russia and China was regarded as a bit of a joke at the time, nobody took them seriously, and then they went off on with the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward and so on, and sort of didn't really have much of an influence outside China, apart from on Third World revolutionary groups like Zanla in Zimbabwe. But the turning point is 9/11 on one level. And of course that came in after the dot-com bubble had burst, and they didn't we didn't used to believe in bailing out markets, but after the dot-com bubble burst, then 9/11 came along, and they suddenly bailed the markets out, and so this began the money printing process. 2019 was a very big turning point, as has been suggested. In September 2019, the repo market in the US collapsed, but we didn't find out till later on, and that's when BlackRock and Vanguard took over, and basically took over the Federal Reserve. Well, so they were deciding which financial companies live and die, and they don't even say on what criteria they do. Of course, they're basically bailing themselves out. And then, of course, the pandemic kicks in. Where I would differ from the analysis that I've heard is that I think that the pandemic is in fact a biological warfare attack, and the vaccines and all the rest of it. Many people in Russia and China have not been given big pharma vaccines, and I think they've worked out what's going on. Kirillov, who's the head of the biological warfare troops in Russia, has basically said, look, we've captured all these biological warfare labs, and they went to the UN with it, and of course the British and the Americans vetoed any discussion on it.
Well, actually, Art was asking about, Martin, though, was the the idea of public knowledge, really, and research. That is, the research institutions in our universities and in our mass media now seem to basically being hijacked.
Well, they always were, to some extent, is the answer that I would give to that. They've been more hijacked. It's very much more difficult to be an independent academic than it used to be. I mean, once you had tenure at one stage, they couldn't get rid of you. But we've just seen what's happened to David Miller here in Bristol, where without, even though there was an internal disciplinary carried out and there was no evidence of anti-Semitism whatsoever, he's been removed. That used to be unthinkable. Not unthinkable now, is it?
No, not unthinkable with Tony Danker or Dominic Raab either. Anyway, look, you were one of the things that you talk about in your article, David, is this whole idea of false flag terrorism. How do you link that happening now back to the Nazi era?
Well, I mean, the burning of the Reichstag Dome and blaming it on communists, of course, is a precursor for some of the false flag terrorism that was committed under the Gladio operation in the 1970s and 1980s. And as I've suggested, that in turn laid the blueprint for the so-called war on terror. And I think when you put all of this in context, as I do in my article, it becomes very difficult to look at 9/11 as anything but a false flag attack when you know how these intelligence agencies work.
Well, for anyone that may be questioning what is this whole term false flag, isn't it, Martin, to do with naval warfare in the old days?
Initially, when in the days of sailing ships and before modern communications, people would communicate by flags when they're at sea. So a false flag attack is where you creep up on the enemy flying a friendly flag, and then you get right up close to them, and then you switch the flags over and you attack them. And Cochrane, if people have watched the film Master and Commander, he was very famous for carrying out these kind of attacks. And that's
so you'd be flying a flag which would say, "Oh, yeah, we're your friends. We've come to give you some ammunition or something." As the boats come alongside, then a whole load of Marines will charge over and take over the ship.
If you think of the San Nazar raid in World War II, the Royal Navy steamed towards the boatyard where the U-boats were based, and they were all flying German flags. And, of course, as soon as they got there, they took them down and carried out the operation.
And in the modern terrorist context?
In the modern terrorist context, which is more to the point, really, is the idea that the state carries out terrorist attacks, and then it blames patsies, or it blames some third party, in order to control the population. And the evidence for all of this stuff is overwhelming, as we've just been hearing. And of course, there was Imposimato, who's the head of the Italian Supreme Court until recently. He wrote a book that came out in 2012, La Repubblica dei Stragi Impuni, the Republic of the Unpunished Massacres, based on decades of police investigation in Italy, which proved beyond any doubt to anybody who's looking at it that this was all carried out by the state.
But I mean, if we go back just a few years to the 7/7 attacks, there's a lot of evidence that this was also a false flag attack, that the guys who were blamed for it, that they were possibly lured to London on another pretext and then basically fitted up and set up. Another example that might be Sirhan and the assassination of RFK, being hypnotised and told, go there, take your gun, and someone else maybe killed RFK, and then he was caught red-handed with the gun that supposedly had done the killing. But the idea really is to just say it's almost like theatre. Really, what you're doing is you're creating an event which you spin as one side, the enemy, or actually you've done it yourself. Anyway, look, what about the global strategy of tension in this century, the 21st century now, David?
Well, it's interesting that you touch on 7/7 because, as Martin says, actually, there seems to be a lot of evidence that many of these attacks actually are not what we were told. And, of course, it all gets very murky and a lot of it's very difficult to prove. And as soon as you dare to suggest it, you get jumped on and, hit pieces and smears and all kinds of things.
Yes, exactly. By for example, the guy that runs the Centre for Investigative Journalism. I mean, he did a bit of a hatchet job on me after I suggested there might be something to investigate about 7/7. So yes, there is.
I mean, this is exactly
a
how
reluctance,
it goes.
isn't there? There's a reluctance to look at these things.
Yeah, and that's called flack. They send it your way in order not only to discourage you from looking into it, but to discourage others as well. So I tried to keep this as kind of academic as I could in the paper, and I went back to the book you mentioned earlier, States of Emergency by Van der Pijl, and there's an interesting passage there on pages 63, 64. And he talks about the Charlie Hebdo attack in France. And he calls it, in his words, quote, a possible false flag operation intended to force President Francois Hollande to change course and instill fear in French society. So this came just after the socialist majority in Parliament had voted in favour of recognising an independent state of Palestine, and just after Hollande had spoken out against sanctions on Russia over Ukraine. So, not towing the line, and then shortly afterwards you have this terrorist attack. But it was the first of many, because there was then the Nice truck attack, the Normandy church attack, the Louvre knife attack, the Champs-Élysées attack, the Strasbourg attack. And so France has been a real kind of inflection point, as it were, for a lot of this. And it almost seems that the greater the social tensions, the greater the protests, the more recourse there is to these kinds of to the dark arts, these nefarious acts of terror, in order to push the society more in the direction of a police state. So what did we see in France as a result of these attacks? 10,000 troops deployed on French streets under the Sentinel anti-terrorism operation. This is very much in line with what Vinci Guerra was talking about in the Gladio context. And of course, it wasn't just France. There was a real period of intensification, I argue in the piece, between 2015 and 2017. And we saw the Brussels bombings, Berlin Christmas market attack, Westminster Bridge, Stockholm, Manchester Arena, London Bridge, Finsbury Park Mosque, etc., etc. And it's really interesting, because it seems as though if that were the strategy, it didn't work. Because in France, the yellow vests, kind of exploded and were taking to the streets weekend after weekend after weekend for well over a year. And it's almost as though, in that context where this strategy is no longer working, that's one of the factors which eventually kind of caused this kind of COVID emergency break, again, to use Van der Pijl's term.
Also, the closer that Jeremy Corbyn got to power, we saw more terrorist attacks here in Britain, didn't we? With the Manchester Arena, you mentioned there, London Bridge and Westminster. Maybe a correlation there, David?
Yeah, quite possibly. And, I mean, what troubles me is that if you are intellectually honest enough to actually look at the evidence, very often the evidence does seem to give serious cause for concern. And I find it deeply frustrating that academics just refuse to look at the evidence. I mean, at the moment, for instance, think about the Manchester Arena attack. I mean, Richard D. Hall is coming under all kinds of flack for that from the BBC and from victims' families.
To be fair, from me as well, for saying that the victims' families are lying when they say that they've lost a loved one. I mean, this is a very, very serious charge to make.
Yeah. So what I was going to say was, you can certainly question the ways he went about some of this. However, if you actually just look at some of the evidence that he presents in the findings, some of it is quite hard to argue against. So that does trouble me. And
this is a propaganda technique potentially, isn't it? That you bring up some genuine concerns and mix them with fake concerns, which are likely to, literally very unethical journalism, where you're accusing the victims of actually being perpetrators of an attack. I mean, that's obviously absolutely unacceptable.
Well, I'm just more concerned in the evidence, really. And my point is simply that when you just focus on the evidence, oftentimes it's quite strong. But again, there are strong mechanisms in place to deter people from actually doing an open and honest appraisal of the evidence. So I just kind of try to step back and look at these attacks in the aggregate, without making any judgment on any individual attack. Was it or was it not a false flag attack, and just demonstrate that actually collectively they fit a pattern. And what's very, very interesting about this is from 2020, when there's this paradigm shift from the war on terror to biosecurity, all of a sudden the terrorist attacks largely dry up. Not completely, but compared to how frequently they had been taking place, a dramatic reduction. And again, you have to ask questions, why would that be?
Well, you do, and certainly why would it be that the COVID scare seemed to absolutely vanish almost the minute that the Russian troops went into the Donbass and started fighting Ukraine? Right.
So, what this tells you is that very often we are dealing with phony narratives which are being pushed out in a very carefully coordinated manner transnationally, and it's through that coordination that their power becomes so great that so many people buy into them, and it becomes possible to kind of drive the population to in whatever direction you like. And again, it's interesting just to go back to the Nazis, but in 1946, the psychologist Carl Jung was reflecting about the kind of the mass psychosis that he'd witnessed in Nazi Germany, and he uses phrases like it became possible for the psychopaths. He actually calls the leaders psychopaths to drive what he calls the hypnotized sheep, meaning the people, in whatever direction they liked. And the end result of that was World War II and the Holocaust. And what bothers me, and I and my co-authors make this claim in our two recent pieces criticising Matthias Desmet's work, what bothers me about this is we're seeing a similar kind of pattern now where, for 2 years, everything is COVID, and that's all the population can think about. And then almost overnight, in kind of January, February 2022, that suddenly switched off and mostly goes away, still rumbling on in the background. But then all of a sudden, everything is Russia-Ukraine. And these Ukraine flags are flying all over the place. And to me, it's just an extraordinary demonstration of the power of propaganda and psychological warfare, just to be able to get people to go in whatever direction you like. And it's really quite terrifying. And the historical precedent indicates that it's also extremely dangerous.
Is there an argument, do you think, for throwing your computer out the window and putting a brick through your television?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, well, I certainly don't have a smartphone. I mean, maybe without going that far necessarily, what we need to realise is that, we didn't get very much into technocracy, but it is all about the technocratic control grid. And obviously the internet is a key part of that. It may be that they have other kind of EMF ways of enabling that grid as well. But people sometimes say, what can we do to challenge what's going on? And Simon Elmer, he has an interesting take on this. He says, well, at the individual level, of course, there's non-compliance. At the group level, there's civic disobedience. But one very practical measure, which really could put a massive dent in all of this, is if everybody were to get rid of their smartphone. Because so much of this relies on the smartphone, not just the conditioning, but, the QR codes and the way they were pushing towards the kind of health passes and all the rest of it. And Klaus Schwab and Thierry Mallory write in their book about how this is kind of due to go under the skin in due course. So, most people carry these devices around. They're inseparable from them. They sleep next to them, etc. Well, all this is doing is hooking human beings up to this technocratic control grid. And again, this is where I have deep concerns about the actual contents of the injections. Does this feed into it as well? So, yes, I think there's a really strong case actually for ditching the smartphones. But the trouble is, about 99.9% of the population is literally addicted to them. They literally can't do it.
Well, yes, I was going to say it's a forlorn hope. If you ever, like, literally, half the people, particularly young ones, walking down the street are staring into their smartphone. It's connected into their ear. If you were to say, excuse me, then they probably wouldn't hear you. They walk straight past. And often you see even couples sitting down together, neither of them speaking to each other, both of them on their phones. But look, I think one of the most important final section in your article is about Nazis or descendants of Nazis, siblings or whatever. No, actually kids of Nazis, I suppose, in positions of power today, David.
Right. So it's not just that there are kind of structural and class factors which explain, some of the Nazi features resurfacing today. That I described at the beginning of the interview today. There's actually, in some cases, actual family lineages as well. And I just mentioned a few of them towards the end of my article. I mean, the really obvious one, of course, is Klaus Schwab. His father, Eugen Schwab, was the managing director of a company called Hughes, and this was granted special status by the Nazis, permitting slave labour. So that's his heritage, and of course we know what he's doing today. He openly boasts that his young global leaders have penetrated the cabinets of multiple countries. Again, just stop and reflect on that, the crisis of liberal democracy at the moment, and we have this guy whose father was very well placed with the Hitler regime, openly boasting about penetrating the cabinets.
I mean, it's worth saying something about these Nazi companies, because this was something that happened in the 1930s in Germany, is the Nazification and the SS-ification of many companies, that they would become Nazified. They would have swastika flags outside the company and around the railings, etc., pictures of Hitler down the corridors, and of course the most supreme accolade, and Schwab's company seems to have had that, is that the SS would deliver them workers, and they would pay something like 5 marks a day per worker as a slave in their factories.
That's correct. And again, it's this fusion of the state and big business.
Yeah, because I think, David, there's quite a lot of people, Andrew Neil's one of them, who sort of excuses this and say, well, you had to be a Nazi, but many people were Nazis, but they weren't really into, this cult of Hitler and the SS and that kind of thing. Well, I'm afraid, if you're taking slave labour from the SS, then you are part of it.
Yeah, and the Schwabs are not the only ones. I talk about the Quandt family as well, tremendously wealthy family in Germany. But they set up what one critic described as a company-owned concentration camp, their words, not mine, where workers were told upon arrival that they would no longer live, that they would not live longer than 6 months on account of exposure to poisonous gases. So if that account is true, again, that's the caliber that we're looking at here with the Quandt family. They also had very close ties to Goebbels and to Hitler. And what you find when you look at the descendants is that Johanna Quandt, granddaughter, was one of the wealthiest women in Germany, and she's been throwing money at the Charité Foundation in Berlin, major hospital there. So she's involved in funding healthcare. Her grandfather was a director of the Institute for Hygiene at the Friedrich Wilhelm University, which is where a lot of the Nazi eugenics experiments took place.
Well, you're talking here about the Quants, I think is I mean, certainly how it's pronounced here in the UK.
Sorry, I've got the German pronunciation going.
Yeah, the Quants. Quants. And it's funny because I noticed Mary Quant died last week, I think it was. This family that were major battery manufacturers for the Nazi regime. And as you say, they certainly after the war, were sort of rehabilitated really by the West, and they said, oh, well, these people are really cool, quite quaint, and they took I think it was a big stake in the BMW company. And if anyone is interested in looking further into this, and thinks that we're a couple of conspiracy theorists, well, we're most definitely not. There is a terrific documentary called The Silence of the Quants, which caused an absolute sensation in Germany because the journalists in Germany put this documentary together because the Quants were completely in denial, and in a way which is rather worrying, particularly in our own royal circles in denial about answering very basic questions, such as, are you going to have a multi-faith service at the coronation, or are you going to be the head of the Church of England, or are you going to be the head of multi-faiths? I think we just need to make sure that our leaders and our civic and our industrial leaders are there to answer these basic, simple questions. But anyway, back to the quants.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting that you bring up that documentary. That's actually the source of the quote that I gave a few minutes ago. But I mean, there are other families as well. David de Jong recently published a book called Nazi Billionaires, and he goes through the Flick family, the von Fink family, the Porsche family, the Oetker family, all of these families, very, very wealthy, former ties to the National Socialist regime. And we mustn't overlook all of this. These are very real lineages. And the one final example I give has to do with Canada, actually. And Chrystia Freeland, who, of course, Deputy Prime Minister of Canada. She sits on the World Economic Forum Board of Trustees. But it emerged recently that her grandfather, Michael Chomiak, was a Ukrainian Nazi collaborator. So, again, it's not automatically to say that she must hold these sympathies herself, but she did tweet a picture of herself holding a red and black flag associated with the Bandera movement. And, when that was pointed out, she deleted it without comment. So, unfortunately, the kind of the end result here is that although we would like to think that the Nazis and what they stood for were kind of dead and buried in 1945, unfortunately, their influence is more than alive today.
Well, I mean, my own evidence seems to have dug out links to Martin Bormann, particularly between Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, and Desmond Morton, Winston Churchill's private secretary, and the mass laundering of the Nazi wealth from Switzerland and South America through the Sullivan and Cromwell, the Dulles Brothers law firm, in New York to create a kind of financial Fourth Reich. Do you think that's fair?
I don't know. I don't know enough about that. I'd be interested to look into that.
Well, I have to send you the book. And also, when it comes to the technocracy, this is something that's very difficult, I think, for some people to understand. And what do you make of this whole business of accelerationism, which is apparently, according to David Livingstone anyway, my old school friend, I mean, he was a school friend, Nick Land, has put together. What do you make of accelerationism and its link to the way that things are changing right now?
Well, I don't know that much about it, and from what I do know, it's quite a broad church, so I don't want to kind of caricature it. But the idea seems to be that it's all about there is no kind of alternative to the current system. Yes, it may be bad, but we need to speed up, accelerate technological developments as much as we can in an attempt to kind of push past the existing system, and it might involve destroying the existing system, but ultimately we have to get beyond it. Now, I mean, it strikes me that this is just the latest instantiation of a kind of secular millennialism almost, that, these images, these ideas come up again and again in history, that we have to somehow kind of transcend our kind of fallen human state, and even if that involves destroying everything that we know and just, destroying society and rebuilding, and of course, Build Back Better comes into all of that. I mean, as far as Nick Land goes, I feel sorry for him. I mean, the guy seems demoralized, very defeatist kind of position that he holds, as part of a cult, doing loads of drugs and had a mental breakdown. So, that's not the kind of character whose views that I would take particularly seriously.
No, but I mean, a lot of this does seem to actually be transpiring, doesn't it? The idea that, that humanity may become literally slaves to artificial intelligence.
Yeah, and what goes missing from a lot of this, again, is class. And, you see a similar kind of vision in transhumanism and, Ray Kurzweil's idea of the singularity. I mean, that very much seems compatible with this idea of kind of acceleration, technological progress getting faster and faster and faster and faster and faster. But of course, transhumanism is just the latest form of eugenics. And what a lot of this hides is an attempt by the ruling class, essentially, to enslave everybody else. I mean, it's interesting, the piece you sent me on land, he's very early on in there, he actually uses a Marxist term. He says, I'm interested in liberation of the means of production. Not liberation of the working classes, not liberation of the people or of humanity. No, liberation of the means of production. A very, very strange phrase. And it reminded me a little bit of James Burnham, the former Trotskyite, in the 1940s. And he gave up completely on Marxism. And the instant he did, he swung violently in the opposite direction and became, one of the most ardent advocates of US imperialism. And so there seems to be some of that in this Nick Lang character, in my opinion, that it's a very despairing kind of worldview that he's got, and as the article you sent me notes, it's laced with kind of racism and eugenics and all kinds of unpleasant themes.
Well, so you're giving me flashbacks to the summer of 1978, where we all went off on our summer holidays with Nick the Nazi, and when we came back after the summer holidays, Nick had become a communist. So anyway, your paper is Wall Street, the Nazis and the Crimes of the Deep State. Dr. David Hughes, by Dr. David Hughes. Actually, you calling it an article. It's me that's calling it a paper. Is it fully referenced?
Yeah, it's fully referenced. Absolutely.
Good. Okay. Well, that's the sort of article I like. How can people follow your work then, David?
Best place is academia.edu, and just do a search for me that way. So whenever I put out a new piece or a new interview or whatever, I tend to post it on there.
And what about books? Got any books out?
One is forthcoming. I'm about to submit the manuscript for it, called COVID-19, Psychological Warfare and the Bid for Technocracy. And it's all about the psychological warfare techniques that have been deployed against the population for the last few years in a bid to effect this transition to technocracy.
Particularly on the pandemic, have you got any particular books you think that maybe people may not have heard of that you could recommend?
Gosh, I mean, where to begin? Ian Davis's Pseudo-Pandemic, I think, is right up there. Van der Pale's States of Emergency, we have mentioned already. Kennedy's Real Anthony Fauci, I think, is pretty important.
Well, look, hang on. What do you make of his presidential bid?
Oh, well, I mean, it could be anything, couldn't it? I'm torn when it comes to Kennedy. So on the one hand, I think that Children's Health Defence has done so much great work that I don't want to take anything away from him. I mean, it's so important. But on the other hand, as far as I understand it, he is part of the kind of the climate change push, which I'm personally very sceptical of. And of course, ultimately he is a Kennedy, and can you trust any kind of major political establishment?
Ultimately, he's likely to have his head blown off, isn't he?
That's one possibility, but I also wonder: is this now the kind of a Democrat version of Trump, in a sense? A person where you can get huge numbers of voters behind him, and it kind of takes a lot of their kind of frustrations away. Thinking they've got this guy fighting for them, and maybe he genuinely does want to, but as we saw with Trump, no sooner is he in office than it all turns out to be a lot of hot air.
Well, it sounds like Biden's got your vote, David.
No one gets my vote.
Okay. And you can't vote in US elections anyway.
Well, we know that, Martin. Yeah, we know. Anyway, look, Dr. David Hughes from Lincoln University, thanks ever so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
So, fascinating stuff, I think, Martin, and, making all these connections with the Nazis. It's the sort of thing we've been our bread and butter for the last, 13, 14 years?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot I agreed with there. I don't share the analysis of the pandemic, but there we go. There's bound to be differences of opinion about all sorts of things.